Η αλήθεια είναι ότι είναι λίγο αμήχανο να παίρνουμε τη σκητάλη από μια τόσο συγκινητική εκδήλωση για τον Τίτο Πατρίκιο. Αλλά εγώ κρατάω τις τελευταίες κουβέντες που άκουσα, ότι σημασία έχει να βρισκόμαστε μεταξύ μας και ότι στο επίκεντρο είναι ο άνθρωπος. Και πιστεύω ότι γι' αυτό μιλάνε και τα βιβλία του Γουίλσον πρώτα απ' όλα. Δηλαδή μπορεί να είναι μια ανάλυση των πόλεων και η ιστορία τους, αλλά αυτό που προσπαθεί να ξαναδεί είναι η δυνατότητα του να ξαναβρούμε την ανθρωπιά μας, πιστεύοντας τις πόλεις. Σοκρατικό το τρόπο μάλλον, αφού και ο Σοκράτης προτίμησε να πιει το κόνη από το να αφήσει την Αθήνα. Ένα εισαγωγικό θα διαβάσω στα ελληνικά και μετά θα ξεκινήσουμε την κουβέντα. Ο βραβευμένος με το Somerset Maugham, Βρετανός ιστορικός και συγγραφέας Μπεν Γουίλσον, έχει αναλάβει το βάρος του αφηγητή της μεγάλης ιστορίας των πόλεων, εξηγώντας πως οι πόλεις ευνόησαν την ανάπτυξη του ανθρώπινου πολιτισμού, αλλά με το δικό του αντισυμβατικό τρόπο. Ξεκινώντας το βιβλίο του «Μετρόπολης» με την Ουρούκ, την πρώτη πόλη του κόσμου, που χρονολογείται από το 4.000 π.Χ. και φτάνοντας στις σύγχρονες πόλεις που υποφέρουν από την ανάπτυξη και τον υπερπληθυσμό, μας εξηγεί πως οι πόλεις είναι συνώνυμες με την ίδια την ανθρώπινη μοίρα, την εξέλιξη αλλά και την καταστροφή. Την ίδια στιγμή που φέρουν το βάρος της υπερανάπτυξης είναι αυτές πως δείχνουν η φύση συνδέεται με το αστικό τοπίο και μπορεί πραγματικά να μεταμορφώσει τη ζωή μας. Τα βιβλία του ιστορικού Μπεν Γουίλσον, «Μετρόπολης» και «Αστική ζούγκλα», κυκλοφορούν στα ελληνικά από τις εκδόσεις Διόπτρα. Όποιος θέλει μπορεί να τα βρει στα στάντ που υπάρχουν έξω και θα τοποθετηθούν τώρα, αλλά μπορεί και να μείνει μαζί μας μετά το τέλος της εκδήλωσης, γιατί ο συγγραφέας θα υπογράψει βιβλία. Sorry about that, my Greek introduction, but I think I need to explain some things to our audience. Yeah. Oh, okay. We didn't know. So I'm very glad that we have you here. I'm very happy, and it's an honor for me. And I'm also glad to be in such a wonderful place, in Chania. And I would like to start with your first book, Metropolis, and from the title that it deals with the Greek notion of polis, which is the ancient equivalent of, democracy, of direct democracy, of the way public space was working, and agora. And I would like to know, why do you use it as a rigorous and symbolic example just to prove the way cities were transformed throughout the years, and why the transformation of cities is very important, and how do you perceive it?
Yeah, well, first of all, what a wonderful festival to be part of, and it is a real honor to be here. So, the title of the book, Metropolis, I mean, it literally means mother city, doesn't it? The way that some cities in history have a kind of outsized importance, where they kind of represent something about the spirit of their age, and they transmit their ideas. Is the... No microphone, okay.
How can you open it? Just try again.
Hello? No. Is this one working?
Maybe you can use my microphone.
Okay, let's share. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, is that better? The idea, I think, for this book was to tell a story of the history of... Is this better? No? Closer. Yeah. Yeah. Is this better? This is better, isn't it? Yeah, we've done it. We've got there. The idea of the book, the idea of kind of a metropolis, is the kind of like a city that speaks more beyond its time and place. So the book is a kind of chronological history of cities and urbanism, using certain cities as kind of the examples of the metropolis. So it begins in a city called Uruk, which was the first city in Mesopotamia. And I sort of begin that story of why do people move to the city? What's the kind of, that sort of Faustian bargain almost, to give up a life of being a hunter-gatherer or an agriculturalist and move into a profoundly unnatural setting, which is the city. And then I talk about Uruk, and that leads on to cities like the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley, other sort of like the flowerings of the beginnings of other cities and urban civilizations around the world. The reason that, to get to the Greek part of it, is there's plenty of books about Athens and the Greek world and the ancient Greek world and its influence. But I really wanted to use the Greek cities, the ancient Greek cities, as a way of saying something new in the history of urbanization. So it's not a history necessarily of Athens, it's a history of urbanization. And what is different about the Greek cities is the idea of the polis, about human beings, well, not human beings, free males, let's say, the citizens of a city being part of the city and using, in a radical way, the public space in the city for a mix of activities. The Agora is a place which is a marketing of food, settling of legal disputes, gossip, discussing philosophy, all jumbled up in one kind of democratic, or at least sort of citizen-based public space. And in the, what I'm sort of talking about cities in the kind of the long history of urbanization, it's about the collision of ideas. It's about the spontaneous bringing together of people, whether it's, you know, in a city like Uruk, whether it's in coffee houses in London in the 17th century, where the coffee house became the kind of the beginning place of modern capitalism. So they're unexpected places often, and the way that cities provide these kind of, and keep reinventing the spaces that are public. So the early cities didn't have that. They were conceived around a focal point, which was a sort of focal point of divine power. The cities were where, for the Mesopotamians at least, and in Chinese civilizations and in Central American civilizations, it is where humanity encountered the divine. It's very different to Christianity, but in those early civilizations, it is the meeting in a divine space between the humans and the cosmos, right? It's a sort of crystallization of that power, and it magnifies the power of human beings when they come together, right? So the beginnings of the written word, the beginnings of finance, bureaucracy, the beginnings of sort of a lot of our creative activities, of literature, all happen in an urban environment, and happen very quickly when people come together and sort of collide in this kind of way, but also a lot of the bad aspects of human beings, slavery, war, kingship, are all associated with those very early urban centers. But in the Greek world, it's something else. It's the beginning of a public space and a kind of jostling of people and ideas, which is so important. And sort of in the chronology of the book, it is the forerunner of the souk, the bazaar, the forum, the public baths, the gymnasiums, stadium, and the things that we very much take for granted, and maybe something we should be well aware of and remember, that cities provide a space for the coming together and the discussion of ideas, whether it's a book festival, yes, however that manifests itself in our urban history. It's so important. So my chapter on the Greek world is in part a celebration of a kind of cosmopolitan city, which Athens was, which was proclaimed itself to be open to the world, and that derived its strength. And it culminates in Alexandria, which is a planned city, a place where knowledge is not a thing of the agora, of the open city. It's a much more authoritarian city, and the knowledge is institutionalized within the Library of Alexandria. So in that chapter, we have two things which I think are very important and run through the history of urbanization, which is, on one hand, the organic city, where it's unplanned. Athens was an unplanned and very, we think of it as a very grand city, but it was often a kind of unsanitary and kind of organic city. And then a lot of the other Greek world, which was this desire to impose a kind of rational idea of the city and to build and to distill that power through architecture and city planning.
And before we get to the burning environmental issues, I think I should not mention the word burning as we suffer from heat wave today. But anyway, I would like to go back to Uruk, because you mentioned Uruk, and it's the first example of the oldest city that is given in the book, and it's indicative of how urban space is characterized by adynomies. And I refer to that city because, on the one hand, it exploited in an effective way its nature resources with an extensive network of canals that created microclimate. And on the other, it produced pollution, sewage. So we can see the adynomies that function there, as in any city. So do you want to tell us exactly what kind of lesson we get from Mesopotamian cities and from Uruk?
What, sorry, what?
What kind of lesson? Do we get any lessons? I mean,
I see, yes. Well, the biggest lesson, I mean, in terms of the duration of these cities, so Uruk, Babylon, Lashak, they're all, these incredibly old cities. So I should sort of say a little bit about how they formed, and that's an environmental question as well. I mean, the idea that cities kind of follow a progression from the invention of agriculture through to the village, through to a town, through to a city, I think is completely wrong. It was always thought that cities relied on an agricultural surplus, and then a control by a kind of priestly or kingly elite that kind of controlled the resources. Now, I think that something very different happened, which was it was much more of a inheritance of a hunter-gatherer society. Sea levels were much higher at that time. The Persian Gulf extended much further into Mesopotamia. These are very marshy delta environments, which were a mixture of wild foods, cultivated grain, hunter-gatherer, but an abundance of resources nonetheless. This kind of intersection of the ocean, the river, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the mixture of meeting the desert, meeting marshland, produces not huge fields of wheat, but a kind of mix of agriculture, wild foods, and a kind of placing of the beginning of the city of where sweet water meets brackish water, salty water. And that's the place where the world begins for Mesopotamians. And you build in this flux of water and marshy environment, a place that's stable is a place of refuge, a place of permanence in this swirling but very abundant thing. And the city's really built up from the kind of the platform of a temple, the beginning of what we would see as a ziggurat. And then around it forms crafts, tradesmen. This is over a long period of time. And then a kind of an elite that grows. And then you find managing this kind of place is a matter of bureaucracy. So the first person whose name we know of in history is a guy called Kushim, who was an accountant. The first name that we know in history, yeah. And the second name is the name of a slave owner and his slaves, So that gives you a flavor of what the language is, a way of managing this very, very complex system that's being built up as part of the city. So I've already said one thing to answer your question, which was that climate change was very much involved in the beginnings of urban civilizations. And the kind of the way that the Mesopotamian cities develop and flourish, rise or fall, is very much dependent on the course of rivers, on the salination, on the way that irrigation can bring resources, you can manage the landscape and make it maximize its productivity, and that's why cities have this divine thing, because it maximizes human creativity. It marshals resources. Uruk was called the sheepfold. It's a place of safety. Now those, I mean, on the bigger scale, those cities do provide us with a lesson, because in general, throughout history, cities aren't destroyed by warfare. In fact, cities that are destroyed by warfare are often rebuilt. If you think of Warsaw or Hiroshima in the Second World War, that even in the ashes of a destroyed city, that there's a rebirth of urban civilization. The real kind of enemy of cities has always been climate change. And although these cities lasted for an immense amount of time, each kind of layer of the city being built on another, ultimately the changing course of rivers, the way that the soil becomes salinated over time, means the decline of that civilization after thousands of years. But I think, ultimately that's the kind of the lesson of cities. There's also, I mean, there's plenty more to say about them.
I believe in the decline of civilization because I think... Oh, sorry. I don't know if you believe in the decline of civilization, because say that, every city has an energy and is a perennial value and has the ability to transform itself into something else. So I think it's very important in your book that we can see that a city, it never ends.
Yeah. No, a city doesn't. Cities don't tend to end. It's only in very certain circumstances that, although empires rise and fall, it's really the city is the form of stability in our world. That cities have this sort of duration that kind of really goes beyond civilization in a way. That the primary unit of our political life, which is the idea of the polis as well in Greek history, is this attachment we have to place. a power of a city goes beyond the power of the civilization to which it's attached. There's this constant kind of renewal of cities where there isn't a renewal of civilizations. The civilizations sort of rise and fall, but cities kind of transcend that. And actually in the Mesopotamian example, what we call the Mesopotamians, the Sumerian people, are constantly kind of invaded by what they would call barbarians, from nomadic barbarians, who become city dwellers very, very quickly and adopt the traditions, you know, ways of life, of being, of the luxuries of a city, and become acclimatized to a city very, very quickly. So, yeah, I think the cities have this kind of seductive power. They sort of draw people in. They have an attachment to them as well, and a kind of permanence which kind of goes way, way beyond kind of other forms of more fleeting, actually much more fleeting forms of political units, of which I include empires within that. So the cities go way beyond that and do reinvent themselves. I mean, Rome, you know, after the cutting of the aqueducts, it goes from a city of 1 million people to a village, essentially. But even within that, the power of the city to reinvent itself is pretty clear, I think, from the long history, right?
And you provide examples from many cities that are still unknown. I mean, I didn't know they exist, like the Lübeck. It's a free city that it existed during the Middle Ages. And you say that it was destructed, but the destruction of which destroyed one of the greatest works of the late Middle Ages. And I remember the title is The Dance Macabre,
yeah,
which is a great example of how art is indicative of, you know, the transformation of the cities. And I like that you draw on, you know, those kind of examples, artistic examples from art, from literature. And I think they speak volumes about, you know, cities and the way they were transformed.
yeah.
You are not, you know, 100% historian. You're a magician in the way you are using those examples.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah, I mean, I like to, you know, as a historian, to get my evidence and information from as many sources as possible, and to try and tell stories in ways that they haven't been told before, by using things particularly of which were part of everyday life or were part of the sort of the popular culture of the time, however that manifests itself. Lübeck's a really interesting example of a city which was... Lübeck's a city in northern Germany, if you don't know it, on the Baltic coast. It was the leading city in a thing called the Hanseatic League in the Middle Ages. The mayor of Lübeck was much more powerful than the King of England, you know, which goes to show that the cities have this huge amount of power, that it was a small city, but it loaned money to the King of England, and when the money wasn't paid, it could seriously disrupt English ways of life by having a much more powerful navy. Up until really the 16th century, that Europe was a collection of city-states, which is incidentally why Europe's such a violent continent and developed very, very much more powerful militaries than anyone else. Was this constant competition between cities, and a kind of, if you go to the walls of Lübeck, or look at pictures of how it develops, it's this constant arms race of defence and offence among cities, which is really very much, you know, an important part of European history, I think, is this fragmentation into cities. The Dance Macabre, the Dance of Death, was this incredible series of paintings, and it reminds me, the Dance of Death, which is this kind of procession of skeletons, the figure of death, taking the rich merchant, the fat bishop, the knight, you know, all ranks of society down to the afterworld. It's painted in the aftermath of the Black Death, which is itself a reminder that cities are, you know, very dangerous places to live in. You know, they shorten your life. You know, that we always sort of have this bargain that, you know, that you can become very rich in a city. You can kind of, over the generations, become very wealthy. And Lübeck's a very good example of that, of people who come to the city as outsiders and become the nouveau riche of their time, power brokers and rich merchants and military leaders. But you can be killed. A lot of the people were wiped out by the Black Death in cities. But that also has a leveling effect in the way that, you know, in Germany, in a city like Lübeck, over the city walls, it says city air makes you free. In a world of serfdom, sorry, yeah.
And there is also an interplay between prosperity and destruction, and don't you think so? I don't know. And disaster as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always kind of make the case when I'm writing that cities are a product of their disasters as much as their successes. That, you know, in a history of a city, you can see very clearly the results of war, economic depressions, booms, busts. That it's, you know, that cities possess this resilience, and it's an object lesson in history itself. I think that. You know, bearing witness to the ups and downs of human life in its buildings and their various uses. I mean, you can wander around even, you know, this city or any city and see these kind of tide marks of history that have kind of occurred over time, and that buildings, I guess the sign of a successful city is its constant reinvention and the reuse of its buildings. And that goes back to those very early cities in Mesopotamia, which were constantly in this kind of flurry of activity and energy. We're building on the foundations of the last. Yeah, they're like, it's like a rubbish heap that forms over time, and you go down through the layers, and there's the ruins of the past that kind of layer up continually, and they leave these records. And they say, yes, in this book I try and interpret all those kind of remains of the past, whether it's, you know, children's toys or whether it's the sort of records of great men or public buildings. But always, I think, in the book, the cities of dynamic, fluid, constantly changing places. That's their interest. And I say in the introduction, I don't want to write the kind of book which is, here's the cathedral, here's the great art gallery, or the whatever. You know, it's not a book about buildings and the cities as their permanent records. I wanted to catch the city in its movement and its energy. And that's why kind of finding all those, you know, I've got a chapter that looks at different movies or different art, that constantly trying to catch what people saw in their cities, like the impressionist eye of constantly catching people in the act of movement. And that's a different way of writing history and a different way of distilling the idea of a city, rather than doing a kind of like historical city guide, which there are plenty of books like that, but to try and capture and understand, you know, the deeper processes of urbanization and what it means to people, and how we kind of like being thrust together in an urban environment is very challenging to us, and how we kind of survive it and find ways to adapt to it is a really interesting part of our sort of human history.
For example, Warsaw's Old Town is one of the world's premier monuments to the resilience, as you mentioned before, because the resilience of cities and people's respect for their built environment. And you write, with reference to the city, that as long as a city exists in fragments of clandestine projects and human memories, it can never be destroyed. So memory plays an important role.
Yeah, well, in that way, cities are sort of storehouses of our memories, our emotions, and that sort of very, you know, personal attachment to place.
Speak about fantasy and the way we interpret cities.
Yeah,
it's very important because you create a narrative here.
Yeah, the city is a narrative in a way that the city's a labyrinth. You never know a city. You never know. You can never really capture a city or know it. You only know it in fragments, and you know it in journeys. The modern novel, in a way, as it developed in the 18th century, was a kind of exploration of the twisting tunnels and, you know, ways that cities kind of completely surprise and discombobulate us, and a way of trying to process that. So we know the cities in their stories, the kind of the London of Dickens is very real to us, and plenty of other cities have those narratives, have those stories that attach to them, or films that capture an element, an aspect of them. Warsaw's, you know, is a very extreme example, because it was destroyed in as many different ways as you can imagine in the Second World War, from aerial bombardment, the destruction, of course, of the Jewish population, total destruction of a city within a city, the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the most, you know, tragic events in the Second World War.
Well.
And then Hitler really hated, of all cities in the world, he hated Warsaw, and sent in specialist detachments of destructive commandos to destroy every element of the city. But the day it was liberated by the Red Army was the day that ordinary Poles came in carrying suitcases, climbing these sort of mountains of rubble, and began to rebuild the city that people had smuggled out, architects had smuggled out plans. The city was reconstructed as an act of memory from postcards, prints, old maps, photographs. Every bit of visual thing was created to recreate the centre. Whilst modernist architects dreamt of kind of realising urban utopia by building the kind of modernist city in Warsaw, which it is, but the centre was preserved thanks to these memories and people's sort of real attachment and horror of losing the city after all the destruction that had been meted out to it. That in general, the Second World War and the Blitz was this kind of great opportunity that was seized on by modernist architects who did something that is really kind of current throughout history. We touched on it a bit with the kind of the Greek philosophical desire to create the rational city, also runs through history as the sort of fear and horror of the remains of the past that cities kind of generate, like a bit like the human ant heap that defies logic, defies rationality, and as Le Corbusier said, was like this kind of like, you know, slaughterhouse of history that was just piled up and was irrational, and that only if you could only have the chance to rebuild a city from scratch, you would have the realization not just of a better, cleaner city, but the realization of the human spirit itself.
I have the sense that you detest, you know, cities that are kind of from scratch. You detest that kind of isolated space and clean-cut projects and the nice gardens. That's why I love your book. You prefer embedded natural environment.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's very fair to say. The kind of that we live in a very rational age now, and the desire to impose kind of conventional thinking on people is very acute now, but it seems to be part of the human spirit, and this desire to create the kind of the ideal city as a way of awakening the human spirit is always doomed to failure, because
the European city that you are fighting against.
Yeah. In the kind of interplay of human behavior, the kind of the randomness, the spontaneous connections, the way that, you know, amazing, you know, advances in human society can happen in a coffee house, not in a university, not in a formally planned part of a city, I think is really powerful. But the desire to create artificially those energies never really works, because we don't know what the power of a city is. We don't know what creates and makes a city so vital and so energetic. It happens kind of in the weeds, as it were, in the kind of off the main bit of the city. It happens.
Tell us about those noisy coffee shops that have formulated the core of the city, like in London, in New York. You believe a lot. I mean, tell us about those coffee shops that are important.
Well, coffee, of course, if you look at the history of coffee, comes from Ethiopia. And it found its way first to Constantinople, Istanbul. And the first time it appears in a European city beyond Istanbul is in London, where a merchant who was trading with Constantinople brings back this black, weird, bitter drink and starts selling it to his friends in the city. At a time when England is a very marginal country, very marginal European country at this time, and is riven by civil war. There's lots of kind of political instability, and the coffee house, as it develops, becomes a space where you can go and it's not mediated by the traditional notions of hierarchy, institutional power, but it becomes a place in the age of kind of Isaac Newton. It becomes a place where science is disseminated to the public. It's a place where news can be discussed freely. There was a parrot in one coffee shop that had learned to say, "Bring me the coffee, tell me the news," and repeated it over and over again, because that's what he heard. People wanted to discuss and hear and talk about the news, and no one was excluded. All you had to do was buy a cup of coffee, and it wasn't alcoholic, so you weren't getting drunk, and it was neutral, and it was where people came together. So Lloyd's, the underpinning of modern capitalism, I guess, is the insurance business, and that happen. I mean, insurance is so important in the way that our economies have developed, and risk is shared. As you know, the modern economy being a sharing of risk happens in a coffee shop called Lloyd's, where Mr. Lloyd, the owner of the coffee shop, he gets the shipping news quicker than everyone else. So everyone comes and buys a coffee, and he reads out the shipping news. And it's where brokers come into contact with ship owners and captains of ships, and even to this day, the people that work in Lloyd's insurance exchange, the biggest insurance exchange in the world, are called waiters, and they stand at, and they act as if it's still a coffee house almost. It's still true to its origins. London Stock Exchange, because it was so rowdy, didn't have an institutional, it wasn't in the Royal Exchange. The exchanging stock, which again is, the radical thing that Britain brings to the world, is the trading of government debt. Hugely important in the development of our economies, is done if you go to a coffee house, and anyone can become a broker. So in this kind of place of conviviality, of people meeting and talking, discussing the news, discussing science, latest inventions, depending on what kind of coffee shop you wanted to inhabit. You could go and hang out with the writers or the artists, or whatever kind of tribe you wanted to belong to. And that's very modern. It's like I was talking about, the Agora in Athens is this kind of radical meeting place of people. They're sort of institutions, but they exist halfway between. Because they're open to people, it becomes institutionalized as time goes on. But you wouldn't have had this development if it hadn't been for this kind of slightly weird, quirky thing called the coffee house, which is kind of why I sort of celebrate that kind of our organic city and want to remind people that, it's kind of, that our best ideas happen in weird and unexpected places and times, and the city's very good at generating those spaces, of which the coffee house was very, very important. And it's, London, because it's so class-driven, eventually it becomes, you go to a gentleman's club to drink your coffee, and it becomes less democratic. But the coffee house culture...
Closed clubs.
Yes, of course, it becomes much more closed. But the coffee house culture of a Vienna or a Paris, it becomes the place where ideas are exchanged amongst artists, and is very, very kind of important and celebrated as a kind of way that ideas just spark and generate, and you can kind of float in and out of a coffee house. So, yeah, I think those kind of coffee house kind of coffee's still very important in cities. It's this kind of lifeblood that runs through a city. So it should be celebrated within a history of urbanization. I think the good old coffee shop.
Go back to art, and I like that you draw on painting and literature such as Goethe's Faust to show the historic relationship of habitants with their nearby natural spaces that provided precious resources. So I don't think that the references are accidental, because they show us that the past paves the way for the future, and that art offers valuable examples of reality. And I don't know, how important is art in the work of a historian in general?
Well, it should be. I think history should be omnivorous. I think it connects lots of different thought. You can't be a historian without being a philosopher to a certain extent, a geographer, and art is kind of important for me because it's where I kind of became a historian, was sort of halfway between art and politics, and I learned my I learned my kind of skill as a historian by looking at cartoons and interrogating them, and the political sort of satires of the 18th century were kind of what engaged me in history and kind of led to my first book. So I'm very kind of attuned to the visual evidence within history, but also that the images don't tell a straightforward story. They're always representations of something, and it's a sort of sensibility that we live in a very image-saturated world, and we're good to one extent or another at kind of interpreting those images, but they're there all the time. So being aware in the past of what images mean to people, what that kind of visual iconography that sort of surrounds our lives, whether we choose to have it in our homes or whether in a gallery or in a cathedral or a church, wherever it manifests itself, we we respond to visual images, and understanding what those images mean at a particular time and place is super important. It's just one of those bits of evidence that you kind of draw on, and I try and draw on as many kind of different and different sort of a kind of kaleidoscope kind of approach to history, in a way that there's all these sort of signs and images out there that can tell us, and cities generate those kind of things. Cities are a place of spectacle, and I think throughout Metropolis, what I want to sort of capture is the kind of the thing that cities are pleasurable places. They're very sensuous places. They're full of smells and foods and foodstuffs, and those kind of, even a recipe book or a menu card can tell us so much about a history of a city, that what people were eating in 8th century Baghdad, the kind of this city of amazing street food, is an important part of the history, and it kind of even intersects with science, because after all, scientists need to eat, and they need to come together and discuss their ideas, and kind of adding the texture of history to any kind of history is super important for me, and it's and it kind of, in a way, it democratizes history as well, because it's how people ate as they moved around a city. Who was selling your food? How did you get from your home to work? Where did you have your cup of coffee? Where did you get your breakfast? They're all important parts. And there's one sociologist I really like who blindfolds himself and goes around London, and he can tell where he is just by the smell. He's a sociologist of smell, which is very Christian, yeah.
And I will continue with your second book, The Urban Jungle. And in your chapter, Parks and Rec, you refer to historical gardens, such as the gardens in Babylon, which is considered as the Sin City, but you invoked it in a positive way to show how it can show us analogies with the present and the future. So would you like to show us how can those historical examples can contribute to the reintroduction of new techniques of dealing with our future? How past can help us reinterpret future?
Yeah, I think, I start with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are obviously a kind of very iconic kind of idea of nature in the city. So I should say that the second book we're talking about here, Urban Jungle, is about the idea we've been talking about the human city, and the way it's sort of represented to us is that cities are very human spaces. And in Metropolis, I use the metaphor quite a lot of the kind of the ecosystem in cities, of where people kind of make those connections, and that kind of way that ideas cross-fertilize. So the second book is telling a kind of a lesser known and lesser thought about aspect of cities, which is their natural side and the way they kind of exist within nature and kind of always have done, but something that we kind of forget about. So there's always been, if we think about the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which probably weren't in Babylon, they were actually probably in Nineveh, but they existed nonetheless. And it was a way of raw power, how the emperor, the ruler, how much the emperor and ruler control nature is the ultimate kind of symbol of power. Is you can bring water from hundreds of miles away to fertilize an oasis within the kind of concrete city. So the Hanging Gardens of Babylon or Nineveh or wherever they are is a very important kind of symbol of the control of nature, and how nature has sort of manifested itself a lot within cities, which is as what the Romans called rus in urb, the kind of the rural in the urban, and that being a kind of an achievement, a supreme achievement of human beings, of the powerful, to kind of control nature, to bring it within bounds that are kind of beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, and kind of better than nature that exists in the real world. So the word that we use, paradise, it comes from a Persian word which means garden, right? It's and particularly an urban garden which is surrounded by water, controlled water, and the paradise is without weeds. It's without the vegetation we don't like. It's this much more perfected nature. And where else would you find perfected nature but in the city? And then you find a kind of reiteration of that throughout, or a re-establishment of that throughout history in terms of formal gardens within city, which are normally for the rich and powerful. And then in a more democratic age, you get a particular kind of landscape, which is probably most famous in Central Park, which is in turn a kind of copy of the English country house garden, which is a wide open landscape with stands of trees. The opposite. No, it's a kind of it's a kind of paradise. It's an English paradise. It's an English gentleman's. Yeah, it's an English gentleman's paradise, which is also reflected in modernism. You know, Le Corbusier's idea of the open, radical city is one that would be very familiar to an English landowner in that it has broad vistas, stands of trees. It's a very simplified form of nature, which kind of corresponds with a kind of idea of stepping out of the urban jungle, as we call it, the kind of the concrete urban jungle, and stepping into nature is a very kind of idealistic kind of representation of nature perfected. So throughout history, we have the constant kind of stating of that thing, whether it's the formal gardens of the Versailles type Baroque gardens, which is, you know, which kind of takes its cue a bit from the paradise gardens of the Middle East or of Mughal India, or the more kind of slightly more rugged English type, which is actually the archetypical park in the world, is the kind of serpentine water, stands of trees that you see in Dubai, you see in America, across American cities, you find in India, you find, you know, the kind of the love of the lawn, mown grass, tidied up kind of nature with maybe sort of stands of very, you know, with very sort of formalized gardens within that, but a kind of landscape, which is kind of anti-city. It's like stepping out of the city into a landscape, which some psychologists and evolutionary psychologists says it corresponds with our desire for open landscapes, which comes from our origins in the savannah. So whether that's true or not, it also gives the perception of safety. An urban park should be safe. You should be able to see what's coming, much like you would on the savannah, because cities are dangerous places as much as anything else. They also, you can host big concerts and sporting events, fun runs and things like that in this wide open landscape. So that's kind of the anti-city. So over time, you know, we've kind of developed a kind of urban ideal of what nature should be in the city, and it's a pretty controlled, you know, version of nature.
I like that you mentioned control, because you provide with many examples about private gardens and tree-lined boulevards, and in order to show how insufficient they are in many cases. So I would like to ask you, as far as, you know, that observation is concerned, that it's something that you hear a lot about, you know, general demand, about nice gardens, and you show in the book how insufficient all these are. And instead, you mentioned that we need green and blue water infrastructure and ecological buffer zones that engage with the natural processes essential to a city's ecosystem. So do you believe that all these can be achieved in practice, an ecosystem like that?
Well, that's a big question. So kind of in opposition to the kind of the thing I've just laid out about the formal parks, the kind of the official side of nature in the city, is that nature has always been in a city, and the kind of the bigger point that I make in Urban Jungle is that cities are unique ecosystems. For a lot of our, you know, maybe one of our problems as a species, or the problems of modernity, is the way in which we've disengaged ourselves from nature. You know, and it's as much a mental barrier as anything else. And that's a barrier that says, on one side we have the city, on one side we have civilization, and on the other side we have nature. But if you look at the history of cities, they've always, the boundary between human space, the urban space, and nature has always been a very porous boundary. It's never been a rigid boundary. It's the way that cities are represented to us as human spaces, and I do it a lot in Metropolis, as humans doing things. But if you strip away all the human activity, if you take it away, if you took all the human activity out of London, that's only 40% of the city. 60% is non-human space, and always has been. One, you know, fact I find really interesting. Yeah, we haven't realized nature in the city is hiding in plain sight. It was always seen as very degraded nature. the nature that exists next to us. What's the classic urban animal? It's the rat, right? It's the things we don't. And we have rats and rats with wings. Yeah. They take the tube in London. Yeah, they've learned what stops to get out of. So, yeah, animals can adapt very well to us. But what I mean. Yeah, they travel between their good areas of food and things like that. Yeah, so animals are very kind of good at aping our behaviour. But in general, the symbol of the kind of urban animal is probably the rat. And then the stories of kind of alligators infesting the subway of New York. And those similar stories go back to Roman times of octopuses that kind of climb up, through sewage systems. There's a connection between sewage and kind of like perverted nature gone wrong in cities. So it's something that when nature comes into contact with human beings in the built environment, it goes wrong. And that's for good reason, actually, because if you think about the 19th century city, it's polluted. There's lots of zoonotic diseases that come in with animals and cause huge ecological, huge destruction in cities. There's polluted rivers. The way that nature kind of was kind of degraded within cities, but it led to a kind of a retreat, a pushing back, a cutting back of weeds, a desire to kind of like push out agriculture from cities, which were always big parts of cities. Cities were very, if you go back 150 years, the most fertile land anywhere was on the edge of cities, because there was a circular system between the manure produced by horses that ran the city and the agriculture on the edge of cities. So cities were kind of producing a lot of kind of fertility. We forget that. We forget that Los Angeles was half city, half farm until the Second World War. That it was a kind of ideal to grow your own vegetables. That Paris had several harvests a year because it was so good at harnessing its urban agriculture, and even kind of exported its surplus to England, so you could have French-grown salads in the middle of winter in London. All these were kind of like aspects of cities that we totally forget now. And the idea of nature in the city, until the post-Second World War period, was always seen as, if you're a biologists would say that the cities were sterile places where nature didn't really exist and shouldn't really be studied. It was only after the Second World War, and it was in a particular place. It was in Berlin, which had been cut off from West Berlin, which had been cut off from the rest of Germany. So if you're an ecologist or biologist in Berlin, you could only really just study the city. And Berlin was unique, and it had lots of space because it had been bombed so heavily and hadn't been rebuilt. It was waiting for reunification to happen. So it was artificially kept as a very kind of a rural or very kind of pockmarked city with lots of kind of wild urban spaces. And people studied it. And what they found in Berlin kind of really changed our perceptions of cities, which was that the ecosystem of Berlin, the biodiversity of Berlin outside the parks, in the kind of rougher spaces between railway lines, in bombed old rail yards that had been abandoned, was many, many times greater than the countryside around Berlin. There was way more biodiverse than the parks. The parks, by comparison, were kind of empty spaces. These kind of wild spaces, the overlooked places, actually contain an ecosystem that's not only incredibly biodiverse and very good for things like bees and things like that, but was also worthy of study, and was fast changing. Urban ecosystems change very quickly. They're very interesting, and the way that animals are coming into the cities, especially in places like Australia, where endangered species are finding a home in cities, is telling us actually that the ecosystem within cities is something good. So that goes on to the second part of your question of why we should green our cities. So for two reasons. One, because we're urbanizing. We're urbanizing in the world's biodiversity hotspots. We're intruding into where places that are very good for nature are also places where we want to live. So it's causing untold harm in these biodiverse hotspots. And we're also cities, the biggest threat, as I alluded to at the beginning, is from climate change, from soaring temperatures, floodings, hurricanes, wildfires. And the cities that are most kind of advanced in kind of anticipating climate change were Singapore, which is kind of festooned and uses nature as a way of buffeting itself and protecting itself against the future of climate change, which will hit Singapore very hard. And the other country is the Netherlands, which in the 1990s, about the same time that Singapore was kind of using nature as a resource that, you know, in the past nature had been a resource. Now again, it's being used as a resource. The other one's the Netherlands, which is very, very obviously prone to flooding because most of the country's below sea level. And exists on the delta of the Rhine and other major European rivers. The Dutch are the masters at engineering their landscape. But in the 1990s, they decided on a new approach, which was called giving room to the river. So to allow rivers to do what rivers want to do, which is to flood, change course, do all these kind of things. So it meant a kind of rewilding of the riverbank, kind of letting it go, so taking it out of agricultural, urban space. And so the Dutch, so all those kind of things, if you go to a Dutch city, you go to Amsterdam or Utrecht or Dordrecht or Rotterdam, you find much fewer cars and much more kind of like cities where they take up the tiles. And they're remarkable to walk down these little cities. You come across playgrounds in the city. You come across benches where people sit amongst hollyhocks and other kind of, you know, foliage that's growing. And that's the kind of what I'm talking about. The way that cities reinvent their public spaces. The public spaces that we should really be celebrating and making more of are green urban spaces and bringing back the things that make cities so vital, which is their street life, which we killed with the motor car in the middle part of this century. We've killed a lot of our public spaces and made them very policed, controlled, sanitized places. The kind of the agora of the past is now a controlled space. City is shopping mall. City is becoming more like a shopping mall, whereas the kind of combination of a wilder, rougher nature and the kind of the organic city I'm talking about is a radical act and something that we should be doing and as a way of revitalizing the kind of lifeblood of our cities, making them more resilient against climate change, but making them more fun, more pleasurable places to begin with. So that sort of, I think, brings us, and I think we're kind of running low on time. Yeah. So to sort of recreate that idea of the city as a sociable space, but also as a resilient and adaptive space, is really concentrated on the way that we can re-wild and create public spaces which are, you know, which dovetail with our desire for a more healthy, more ecological kind of urban environment.
I think we are running out of time. I don't want to annihilate you, but I want to wrap it up, and I will pose a last question, okay? So every day an area of land the size of Manhattan gets urbanized, and the major part of urban land will have been built by 2030. This sounds like a nightmare, but you can still seem to be optimistic, I think, in many ways, because you claim that urbanization can work in a different way. So would you like to tell us how this can be achieved? Because I think you are optimistic in the end.
Yeah, I'm optimistic, so I'm going to have to wrap this up very, very quickly. So in a sense, it's in the West, in the global North, that we've become very bleak about our cities. But in other parts of the world, cities are still a place where people leave rural poverty, which we should remind ourselves is a serious, serious problem and very miserable. So cities are sort of generators of wealth, maybe not for the first generation that go there, but by bringing people together, there's that kind of energy. So we should still see cities as a place where change can happen for people. It might not be for us. We might be moving beyond that. We might be moving into a world of AI, social atomization. But a large part of the world, most of the urban energy is concentrated in very, very different places. So that's maybe something to celebrate. The problem and the opportunity is that we know a lot more about how cities interact with nature, and that urbanization can be a positive thing for nature. That if we're better stewards of our urban environment, we can actually maximize biodiversity, we can shelter endangered species in cities, we can make them better places to be. So just think, even of desert cities, that all the resources that we bring to a city, the water we've used to feed our gardens, we can transform and make cities much more biodiverse. And I think the way to look at it maybe is that I'm not saying we're going to make a better world, we're not going to stop climate change, but we can mitigate its effects. if we're sensible, we can create urban environments that benefit people and nature and limit some of the tremendous harms that we do to the world by just maybe being more conscious of the power that cities have had throughout our time, the way that they're sociable and pleasurable places, but also ultimately, which is the more kind of recent discovery, is their kind of ecological value and ecological potential, which can always be, is continually be maximized. So, you know, maybe leave on this thought that over the last decade, London's created a green space equivalent to the size of Regent's Park, which is not a small park, just by wilding rooftops. This week, Transport for London announced its runs all the infrastructure, has rewilded a vast amount of space in the city by turning roundabouts and road verges into productive meadows, which are brilliant for insect life. Now, this is kind of conjuring up wild space out of nothing. It's part of the alchemy of cities, that there's more that we can do. There's always more that we can do. So that lesson, I think, of kind of like producing more productive, wilder green space in cities where no one thought it existed before is probably the aspect of hope that I kind of want to leave you with, that we can always do better.
Gonna keep your last word, hope. I mean, όποιος θέλει υπογραφή μπορεί να τον αποσπάσει έξω, που υπάρχουν και τα βιβλία, διατίθενται και τα βιβλία του. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που ήσασταν μαζί.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.